Thank you, Sean, and thank you very much for tuning into the broadcast today. This is the Schiffer Report. I'm your host, Paul Schiffer, and today is part one of a very important two-part radio broadcast. We're continuing this broadcast Wednesday, when this show airs again, Wednesday, 4 o'clock. Today's part one, covering the third terrorist, the Middle East connection to the Oklahoma City bombing. That was a best-selling book that came out about a year and 5 months ago. The author, award-winning investigative journalist Jana Davis, did a great job putting together all of the documentation that shows beyond a shadow of a doubt to many, many people, including people like former CIA Director James Woolsey, former Assistant Secretary of Defense Frank Gaffney, and one of the greatest national security affairs intelligence officers this country's ever had this century, the late, great Konstantin Menges, and many others have said that her sightings for her book, The Third Terrorist, were very credible. She interviewed dozens of witnesses who saw that there were Arabs that were involved with the Oklahoma City bombing. Unfortunately, this story is still shelved. It reappears every once in a while. We have Jana on again today because there's been new developing news concerning this, more pieces to the puzzle, so to speak, that have come out since The Third Terrorist came out first last year. You can find it now in paperback version. Again, we're speaking with Jana Davis today and Friday here in the Schiffer Report. Her book, The Third Terrorist, the Middle East Connection to the Oklahoma City bombing. Today we're going to do a quick overview of the book. Friday we'll have a lot of the new explosive information that corroborates even further her great book. Now let me start this interview off by going to an impeccable source, one of the greatest people there on Capitol Hill who was involved with the impeachment trial of Bill Clinton. I'm referring to David P. Shippers, former chief investigative counsel for the impeachment trial of Bill Clinton. He says this about Jana Davis in her book. If you are a citizen who is seriously concerned over your own security and that of the United States, it is critical that you read this book cover to cover. I can say with certainty that you will be astounded by the investigative ability of Jana Davis, dismayed by the ineptitude, if not outright incompetence, of those charged with investigating the Oklahoma City disaster, and above all, enraged by the inexplicable policy adopted by our government to cover up a state-sponsored Middle Eastern terrorist act in the American heartland 6 years before 9/11. It is my honest opinion, David Shippers again, that if the Department of Justice and the federal investigative agencies had not ignored Jana Davis and instead accepted the massive, credible evidence compiled by her indicating direct Middle Eastern involvement in the bombing, the course of future events may have been altered. Furthermore, had those investigators taken their duty seriously and followed up on the investigation of that information, it is entirely likely that the Twin Towers would still be standing. With that, we bring the audience Jana Davis. Welcome back to the Schiffer Report, Jana.
Oh, Paul, it's really an honor to be back here with you. Thanks so much for having me.
You know, if your information was not credible, even appearing credible, you would not have the backing or the endorsements of people like David Shippers, James Woolsey, Frank Gaffney, and many, many others.
I don't think that those gentlemen would lend their names and reputations to something they considered an unproven conspiracy theory. And that just comes with a lot of hard work and persistence on my part. My story began 10 years ago, and it still hasn't ended. As you just said in your introduction, we're still working to get the attention of the American people because the story of the third terrorist, I believe, is more relevant today than it was a year ago when it was first published on the anniversary of the April 19th bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah building. And the reason why is because I believe it serves as a paradigm, a prototype of terrorism here in America and what threatens national security. And that is what we're hearing in the news today. The latest that there may have been a Al-Qaeda cell in New York with Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker from 9/11. Who can forget that man's stony cold, wicked face on the airwaves after 9/11? And that it was right here in our midst, a sleeper network that had been activated to strike us from within. And that's what I found 10 years ago when I was working as an investigative journalist for the NBC affiliate, KFOR-TV in Oklahoma City. Our station was situated just a few miles north of the Murrah building when the bomb occurred. So I was one of the first correspondents on the scene. I was one of the first reporters to be taken live by CNN Because KFOR-TV, if people go back, if they have recorded footage of that horrible day in American history, they will see that the majority of those reports were coming from my station, and they might see me having a bad hair day, but I was down there. And the bottom line here is that my investigation began right there at Ground Zero. And within 24 hours, because I was an investigative reporter for the station, my news director came to me and said, Jana, I want you to look into those responsible. Well, of course, I thought that this lady is nuts. At that time, all eyes were trained on the Middle East. There were striking parallels to the first World Trade Center attack that had occurred 2 years prior. We had all the pundits on the airwaves, one after another, parroting the same message, that this has all the earmarks of a Middle Eastern truck bombing. I certainly, as a reporter for a Midwestern television station in Oklahoma, didn't have sources inside the Israeli Mossad or inside the CIA in the Washington Beltway to advance this story any further. So I did what any enterprising reporter would do, is I sat down and I started monitoring FBI satellite feeds of the latest thing going on in the investigation. But I did something else, and it was because I was in the very city where the crime occurred. I just started answering telephones. And you wouldn't believe how many people come out of the woodwork after something of this scope and magnitude, seeking 15 minutes of fame. I was swimming, Paul, in a sea of conspiracy theorists and false leads and people that were sincere, but as the evidence was coming forth from the Department of Justice and the FBI in investigating this case, I could prove irrefutably they were sincerely wrong from evidence that contradicted what they saw. So I started with the rule of the old school of journalism. If you want to deem a witness credible, you better be able to independently corroborate everything they tell you by 2 or 3 independent sources. And everything these witnesses were telling me could not conflict in any way with the proven timeline of the movements of the 2 primary bombers, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. That said, what I found, 22 witnesses, after whittling it down from nearly 100 potential witnesses, who positively identified under oath in very detailed affidavits 8 specific Middle Eastern men aiding and abetting Timothy McVeigh and a few rare instances, Terry Nichols, right here in Oklahoma City, during various stages of the bombing plot. And the most incriminating testimony centered around one man, an Iraqi soldier known as Hussein Hashem al-Husseini. Al-Husseini, according to sworn witness affidavits, is positively identified in the company of Timothy McVeigh prior to the bombing, positively identified seated in the passenger seat of the Ryder truck the morning of April 19th, identified stepping out of that truck at Ground Zero in front of the Murrah building 3.5 minutes before a massive 4,800-pound bomb tore off the face of that building and murdered 171 Americans, positively identified in the driver's seat of a brown Chevrolet pickup screeching away from the curb of the north side of the Murrah building moments before the bomb went off. This man has no provable alibi. He cannot establish his whereabouts for the critical hours of April 19, 1995. To this day, the Department of Justice, despite repeated requests, not only from congressional leaders, including the House Speaker Dennis Hastert, but also from readers and from me repeatedly over the years, the FBI to this day refuses to officially go on the record and clear Hussein al-Husseini of any suspicion in the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah building.
Now, you took the statements from a couple dozen witnesses that you had that said that there were all of these Middle Eastern men connected with the Oklahoma City bombing, people that saw right before the building blew up, Middle Eastern-looking men with Timothy McVeigh, in particular, in specific, a man named Hussein al-Husseini, who you tracked down, and your story of trying to pinpoint him is all through the book. Before we get to the fact that the FBI either discredited your information or took some of the information you had in your 80-page dossier and it suddenly disappeared, let's talk about some of those witnesses that you think were the most credible that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt to you, David Shippers, James Woolsey, and others, that this Hussein al-Husseini can be linked to Timothy McVeigh.
You're talking about witnesses, many of whom are strangers to one another, yet details of their testimonies have uncannily overlapped with each other, unbeknownst to each other. And that's real important. But more importantly, you have a timeline that can place this Iraqi soldier, Hussein al-Husseini, who not only fit the physical description in the official arrest warrant that was issued for Tim McVeigh's accomplice, known as Unsub John Doe 2, but also who was a dead ringer for the third profile sketch that was issued for this suspect. Now, you're talking about a man who was identified in a bar with Tim McVeigh drinking beer on April 15th of 1995. That's 4 days before the bombing. Two witnesses who independently picked him out of a photo lineup as the man who was with Tim McVeigh. This was not a fleeting encounter. This was a bartender who was in front of this man and actually spoke to him and was exposed to him for 3 hours. Then you have another witness who positively identified Hussein al-Husseini filling up a large Ryder truck here in Oklahoma City with $100 worth of diesel fuel, one of the main ingredients in that fuel oil fertilizer bomb, filling up that Ryder truck the evening before the bombing. You have another witness. This gentleman saw a man he identified to be Hussein al-Husseini timing his run from the Murrah building at a breathless pace 1 block east shortly before daybreak on April 19th. You have two other witnesses that were with this runner. They also encountered him. One positively identified Hussein al-Husseini as the man she saw in blue jeans with a backpack, with a stopwatch, running at that breathless pace from the Murrah building, turning around to repeat his trek. She told me, Paul, when I interviewed this woman, and she identified Hussein al-Husseini from a photo lineup, she said, Jana, he had pockmarks on his face. And from the surveillance photographs you have, I can't see his complexion. He had a very ruddy complexion. Well, I was face-to-face with Husseini a few months later. I had never seen him at close range. Right where she told me there were deep grooved pockmarks on his cheeks, they were there. This woman came within 3 feet of him, looked him in the eye. The sun was rising on Oklahoma City. This is April 19th. She encounters a foreign-looking man timing his run from the Murrah building. The other witness that was with her, referred to as Mike Benton in my book, very prominent man in Democratic politics here in Oklahoma City, very well respected in the community, owns his own insurance company, testifies before Congress routinely on insurance issues. This gentleman phoned the FBI within a few hours of the bombing. Within 24 to 48 hours, he was sitting in front of an FBI sketch artist drawing the face of the mysterious jogger he saw that morning. That sketch was never turned over to either defense team. But that sketch burned in the memory of that witness the face of the mysterious jogger. He later identified positively Hussein al-Husseini. He told David Shippers, who came to Oklahoma City just a few months ago in May, in a recorded interview, face-to-face, he said, I testify to this under oath in a court of law, that I am very certain the jogger I saw that morning was the man in these photographs who you've told me is Hussein al-Husseini. Where is the sketch he drew, Paul? Is it the face of the Iraqi soldier that he later identified in a photo lineup? That sketch is missing from the FBI archives. That sketch was not turned over to the defense teams. That is a violation of federal law.
You're listening
These are just a few of the witnesses, but let's take it a step further.
Right.
We're not going to talk about just fleeting encounters here. Let's go back and look at Hussein al-Husseini and a group of Iraqi soldiers that came to Oklahoma City with him about 6 months before the bombing in November of 1994. They were all employed by a Palestinian businessman, an expatriate, whom, according to the federal court record, in the early 1990s, the FBI suspected this man of ties to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He's a real estate mogul. He owns a lot of Section 8 houses here in Oklahoma City. He hired these Iraqi soldiers. He'd never had foreigners on his payroll except for some Mexican nationals. All of a sudden, a group of Iraqi soldiers who served in the Gulf War, claiming to be refugees fleeing the tyranny of Saddam Hussein, show up on his doorstep And on the day of the bombing, according to their American co-workers, they were giving each other high fives and cheering when they heard the first radio broadcast that Islamic extremists had claimed credit for the attack on the Murrah building. And they were chanting in unison, "We love Saddam, we die for Saddam." And they were chanting it in English to make sure that their American co-workers understood what they were saying. Most of these men, these Iraqi soldiers who were chanting, Paul, were absent from work on April 17th, 1995, the day that Timothy McVeigh rented the truck that carried the bomb to the Alpha P. Murrah building.
You're listening to the Schiffer Report. Our special guest tonight is Jana Davis, award-winning investigative journalist. Her book that came out, a bestseller last year and a half ago, is called The Third Terrorist, The Middle East Connection to the Oklahoma City Bombing. Tell us a little more about Hussein al-Husseini's background, what he supposedly told people in sworn affidavits, that he was an Iraqi soldier that left disenchanted with that government. But you had other intelligence experts tell you, and you found out on your own that is not the case, that the man was still tied in with the intelligence services of Iraq. Tell us a little bit about that.
I obtained Hussein al-Husseini's immigration file, and I submitted that information to the former head of human intelligence for the Defense Intelligence Agency, Colonel Patrick Lang. Colonel Lang served as the chief consultant to the United States military and the commander-in-chief at the time, George Bush, during the Persian Gulf War. He was an expert on Iraq. He spent 8 years in the 1980s in Iraq. This gentleman, along with other experts in the Department of Defense, War Planning Department, looked at the file of Hussein al-Husseini. They looked at a very telltale tattoo on his upper left arm. It's an anchor with a serpent wrapped around it. And they determined that this man most likely served in the Iraqi Republican Guard, the Adnan Division, which would match his tattoo on his left hand that says Adnan, and that from there he would have been promoted up the ranks to Unit 999 of the Iraqi Intelligence Service, which once was based out of Salman Park before the war in Iraq, and was basically tasked with covert operations at home and overseas.
We're going to take a quick commercial break in a couple minutes, so we don't have much time to get into the main part what I want to talk about today right now, which is the FBI cover-up. We'll get to that when we get back from the commercial break. But right now, I'd like you to tell the listening audience a little bit about your relationship with FBI agent Dan Fogel. He's now retired, but he's one of the ones that bucked the system and was actually working with you to help get the truth out. What happened to him?
He retired early from the Bureau because he received 22 of my affidavits in 1999 after the FBI refused to take the evidence in 97, turned me away. And then in 99, he set an appointment with me. I turned him over, and he was basically forced into early retirement for taking custody of that evidence.
That's amazing. And then there's a courtroom appearance in 1999. He was asked to speak out about this documentation, but government prosecutors argued that the federal officer's oath of office prohibited him from testifying, so the judge agreed to bar FBI agent Dan Fogel from delivering his important statement. That's a travesty, Jana.
Absolutely, and I consider this man an American hero.
Absolutely. We're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're joined again by Jana Davis, award-winning investigative journalist. Her best-selling book, now in paperback, is called The Third Terrorist, The Middle Eastern Connection to the Oklahoma City Bombing. We'll be right back. and thanks for tuning in today. If you just tuned in, we're interviewing Jana Davis, award-winning investigative journalist. Her best-selling book from last year, The Third Terrorist, is now out in paperback with a new 31 pages worth of an afterword that explains some of the things that have happened in regards to the Oklahoma City bombing and the Middle Eastern connection to that bombing. All of that's in the new paperback version of The Third Terrorist, the Middle Eastern connection to the Oklahoma City bombing. Before we get back to Jana, very quickly, this is what James Woolsey, former CIA director, says about Jana. He says, this fascinating product of Jana Davis's near decade of brave, thorough, and dogged investigative reporting effectively shifts the burden of proof to those who would still contend that McVeigh and Nichols executed the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing without the support of a group or groups from the Middle East. The late, great Dr. Konstantin Menges is one of the greatest foreign policy experts we've had in this country, was responsible for helping Ronald Reagan end the Cold War. He took a liking to Jana and said this: with enormous skill, courage, and persistence, Jana Davis pursued the foreign terrorist connections to the tragic attack on a federal building in Oklahoma. Now her fast-paced book reveals the facts that the Clinton administration did not want to confront. This is a must-read for all who want to see behind the headlines. Welcome back, Jana.
It's great to be here.
Well, before we go further, let me remind the listening audience here, we'll repeat this a couple times today, very important, because this interview, part one of our interview with you today, obviously, as I said earlier, continues Friday. Friday, you got to make sure you tune in, folks, at 4 o'clock here, the Schiffer Report, because we're going to give you a lot of the new information that's included in the afterword of her book, and new information about Congressman Rohrabacher, who's a congressman from California who interviewed a few weeks ago Terry Nichols about the Oklahoma City bombing, interviewed him at his prison cell a few weeks ago. And we refer you to our website, schifferreport.net. That's www.schifferreport.net, spelled SCHIFFER, report.net. Keep the 2 R's in there. Very important you go to our website today, between today and Friday, because before Friday's interview, part 2 with Jana Davis, we're going to have some photos of something else she's going to talk a little bit on today and Friday. Also, we do have very interesting summary, the transcripts of the interview with Congressman Dana Rohrabacher when he confronted Terry Nichols at his prison about his role and maybe possible connection with Middle Eastern terrorists. Jana, before we go any further with your book, Third Terrorist, tell us a little bit about this Rohrabacher article that's now on our website and some of the other things you were going to put up.
Congressman Rohrabacher contacted me after reading my book in March of this year, and then in June, on June 27th, he met face-to-face with Terry Nichols in a prison to ask him questions and about the evidence presented in my book, The Third Terrorist, which placed Timothy McVeigh primarily in Oklahoma City in the company of Iraqi soldiers, intelligence operatives, in the weeks, months, days, and final hours leading up to 9:02 a.m. on April 19th. Terry Nichols, while he kept a hands-off approach and claimed that Tim McVeigh was the mastermind and had him under his web of control and had intimidated him and kept information compartmentalized, he did look Rohrabacher in the eye and say, as for your theory presented in The Third Terrorist, that, quote, could be correct. Tim McVeigh talked about Middle Easterners quite often. I did not meet them personally, but the theory that he was meeting in Oklahoma City with Iraqi nationals could be correct, end quote.
Amazing. They can go to the website now and see that, schifferreport.net, see this new information here. Also, before Friday, we should have up some of the photos of the surveillance videos that were out there before the bombing took place that the federal government refuses to release, videotapes that show what probably happened that day, hours and minutes before the building went down back in 1995. We'll have more on that, though, on Friday's show. Another reason to tune in Friday. Jana, let's go back to some of the leading intelligence experts that you dealt with, became interested in your story. Unfortunately, the Clinton administration tried to shut you down. The FBI under Joseph Free, for no known reasons right now, even though you speculate in the paperback version of your book, they did not cooperate. They refused to take the evidence that you had. Only FBI agent Dan Vogel was ready to testify about your credibility. Tell us about Joseph Bodansky, a great intelligence expert there in the Hill, working for the Republicans in the House of Representatives. You approached him. He was already tracking on his own the very same type of information, and it seems like the witness statements that you got were corroborated by everything Joseph Bodansky knew about the terrorist cells that were there in Oklahoma City at that time.
Right, just to explain exactly who Bodansky is, he is the best-selling author of Bin Laden, the Man Who Declared War on America. He's considered a preeminent expert on Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden, and he served as the director of the Congressional Task Force on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare from 1993 until 2004. And prior to the bombing, after 18 months of copious intelligence gathering from multiple sources in multiple Middle Eastern countries, Joseph Bodansky, as an intelligence analyst, reached a threshold, and it was time, in his opinion, he had enough evidence to sound what they called at that time the silent alarm, which means he put out an alert dated February 27th, 1995. Let's just, backtrack a moment here. That's about 6 weeks before the attack on the Murrah building. And it clearly stated that there would, quote, be an Iran-sponsored Islamic attack on U.S. soil. According to Bodansky's sources, the primary targets were Congress and the White House. And that's a foreshadowing of the events of 9/11. The warning was then distributed to FBI and the other federal agencies within cities across the United States of America and law enforcement agencies, even on the local level. Security was beefed up in the capital city, and all of a sudden, according to new information flowing into the task force, it's now March 3rd, 1995, the plan had now shifted. The terrorists were looking at Plan B. Plan B was to hit softer targets, possibly a government installation somewhere in the heartland of America. 12 cities, according to Mr. Bodansky, were put on the potential target list because of the radical Islamic groups fully operational within those cities. And what was really important at this time, at this stage in the game, the task force director had learned that the Middle Eastern terrorists had recruited what they call in the intelligence community 2 lily whites. That these lily whites were going to be the operatives to carry out the bombing of an American federal building. So what's a lily white? Well, they're also known as cleanskins, and that is actually somebody who has no criminal record that would flag security forces. Also somebody that would have no ostensible ties to Middle Eastern terrorist organizations. Take a look at Tim McVeigh. You got a decorated Gulf War veteran. Terry Nichols, a farmer, a family man, a former soldier himself. They fit that criterion. They had nothing to draw attention, so they could slip below that law enforcement radar screen.
Understood.
So you have specific information that there's going to be an Iran-sponsored Islamic attack. You know now it's going to be somewhere in the heart of the U.S.
And Jana, this was just weeks prior to the Murrah building going down.
You knew it was going to be a government installation. You knew it was going to be 2 lily whites, possibly Americans, but how are you going to narrow down who those people could be? So,
Jana, hold your thought if you don't mind. We're going to go to the phone lines now. You're listening to the Schiffer Report, our very special guest today, and this is live. Jana Davis, award-winning investigative journalist. Her book, bestseller from last year, is out now in paperback. It's called The Third Terrorist, The Middle Eastern Connection to the Oklahoma City Bombing. We go now to Ross, calling us from Cleveland, Ohio. Welcome to the broadcast today, Ross. How you doing?
Good, Paul. How are you? Great show. Good to hear you back on the air again.
Thank you very much. Go ahead. You're free to ask a question to Ms. Davis.
I just have a comment, really not a question, but I just want to confirm part of her story. I was in the Bureau during the Clinton administration, and I had the opportunity to speak to some former Bureau individuals themselves that were posted down there, and they did more or less confirm that the information was out there prior to the bombing, that there was going to be some problems down there. And it's a shame that they can't admit or take care of or do the right thing when it comes to a situation like this.
Thank you so much for saying that, and I just want to make sure the onus is not on the backs of law enforcement and good guys that want to stop the bad guys. As I was going to say just before we took the call, there was not enough specific information to stop that bomb, including Joseph Bodansky. He said, Jana, I received intelligence after that bomb went off, intelligence that had originated prior to the bombing but came in afterwards, and it narrowed it down to Oklahoma City, which further confirmed the theory in the intelligence gathering that it was going to be an Islamic-inspired plot. But beyond that, there was no way to know 9 o'clock, Alfred P. Murrah building, Gulf War veteran driving up in a Ryder truck. And that's real important. They tried to stop it. They couldn't.
And again, one of the good men was former FBI agent Dan Vogel.
Yes.
And you still there, Jana?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I heard something in the background there. Former FBI agent Dan Vogel, he was shut down. He was working with you, had all of that missing evidence. Somehow that disappeared. We wanted you to explain here eventually what happened to all of the evidence you had from all of those witnesses, a couple dozen of them, testifying to the fact that there were Middle Easterners seen with Timothy McVeigh in the days, weeks, and minutes leading up to the bombing of the Murrah building. But Mr. Vogel had some things to say after he was shut down in the courtroom, not allowing to testify. That really ticked him off, and so he gave a rare interview with the Indianapolis Star columnist James Patterson. Tell us a little bit about Dan Vogel's thoughts about all of this.
Well, it was devastating for him because he was the only agent that had the courage to set an appointment with me and actually receive the 22 witness affidavits. And during that meeting in which my husband and my attorney were present, he stated clearly, Jana, we're very concerned about Osama bin Laden. This is 1999, okay? Mm-hmm. This is right around the time that everybody's preparing their reports for the President of the United States, then Clinton, that they wanted to know whether or not al-Qaeda was operating on U.S. Shores. So when I had new information from sources inside the terrorist cell that I had been investigating for years, that their pattern of activity was the same that it was prior to the bombing in the Murrah building, and I was hearing on the evening news that they expected bin Laden to strike again. Remember, this is just about 4 months after he struck the embassies, United States embassies in East Africa, and that there was a possibility he could strike on U.S. soil. I knew I had to try one more time to get these affidavits in the hands of the federal investigative agencies such as the FBI.
Let me quote Dan Vogel right now.
97.
This is taken directly from your book. I think it's one of the most important sections of your book, taking a very credible, patriotic former FBI agent, Dan Vogel, who took everything he had, knew for sure. Many, many people saw these Middle Easterners, especially Hussein al-Husseini with Timothy McVeigh. This is what he said in desperation, exasperation, when the courts won't even let him testify in public. Former FBI agent Dan Vogel saying Jana Davis was giving us a warning back as early as 1997, and we didn't do anything with it. We just refused to take her documents, and I don't know to this day what happened to the documents. Do you know, Jana?
Well, we know they didn't make it into the hands of the defense team as required by federal law. It could be considered, this is a legal jargon, exculpatory evidence, which basically means it would have mitigated the role that Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols as mules, low on the totem pole, and possibly they would have escaped the death penalty as a result. But the bottom line is they were not going to deal with Middle Eastern terrorism on U.S. soil during the former administration because that's tantamount to an act of war and would have required a military response.
And given Clinton's record, giving Clinton's record on covering up this sort of thing and refusing to go after terrorists, I believe you 100%. You're listening to the Schiffer Report. Our special guest is Jana Davis, author of the best-selling book, The Third Terrorist. We have a caller on the line. We'll get to you right after this quick commercial break. Thanks for tuning in today. You're listening to the Schiffer Report. This is part one of a two-part interview with Jana Davis, award-winning investigative journalist who broke the story about the Middle East connection to the Oklahoma City bombing. Her best-selling book from last year, The Third Terrorist, is out in paperback now with a new 30 pages or so of an afterword that goes into more detail explaining some theories about the cover-up itself. from both the Clinton and Bush administrations concerning the terrorist connection to the Oklahoma City bombing. And remember to check our website, schifferreport.net. That's schifferreport.net, because very important information that Jana sent us from Jim Krogan from the LA Weekly. A few weeks ago, Republican Congressman Dana Rohrabacher traveled to the prison where Terry Nichols, Tim McVeigh's accomplice, is being held right now for life, consecutive life sentences. Got an interview, very interesting. Check our website, schifferreport.net. Also by Friday, we'll have some photos pertaining to surveillance cameras, more information on what maybe some surveillance cameras picked up before the Murrah building went down. Welcome back, Jana. Before we get more with your book here, let's go to Doug, who's calling us from Upland, California. Welcome to the Schiffer Report, Doug. Question or comment for Jana Davis?
Yeah, how you been, Jana?
Hey, doing good, Doug.
We haven't talked since last week.
There you go.
Yeah, I've talked to Jana extensively. Besides her other awards, I have predicted that she will ultimately win a Pulitzer. This story is not going to be stopped because Jana is not going to be stopped. And Jana, I want you to tell the audience a little bit about the terrorist cells that are still operating in Oklahoma City and that are operating around our country. I know you're not going to stop, and I think you're finally waking some people up, Jana.
Well, thanks so much, Doug. Appreciate it, because I think the most important issue here is the issues of national security and the fact that we're just now waking up to the enemy living in our midst. And it is the paradigm and the lessons of April 19th, 1995, that the fact that we're not addressing it as a whole from the law enforcement community, from the FBI, may one day be measured in body bags. And I say that without compunction. I'm not an alarmist. But the bottom line here is, if you just turn on your television and you listen to the testimony of the CIA director and the FBI director and the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, all are predicting a succession of Oklahoma-style truck bombings in multiple cities. In fact, the Washington Post just came out with a story 48 hours ago that clearly stated the United States military is now standing by to respond to such things on U.S. soil, and how the military interacting with domestic law enforcement is going to have to change in case of a national emergency of that scope and magnitude. I don't want to see that day come, but I do believe it is coming. When you listen to the experts that say it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And they believe they will revert back to what they do so well, and that is truck bombings, only next time, most likely, a dirty bomb, and then escalate from there. The recruitment of lily whites like Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols, who can slip below the scope of law enforcement investigations. We do not have informants inside these sleeper networks. An estimated 5,000 Middle Eastern sleeper agents living, receiving citizenship here in the United States of America, the majority of whom immigrated here after the first Persian Gulf War. Now remember, a lot of these guys came here claiming to be refugees, claiming that if they had gone back after Operation Desert Storm, they would have been summarily executed by Saddam Hussein. And I'm sure some were legitimately immigrants coming over here and seeking asylum. The only problem is many weren't. And I've talked to the people who actually officiated the screening process for the Department of State that claimed many a night they could not sleep because they knew Iraqi Republican Guard were coming into the United States of America on U.S. dollars, and they were settling here as false defectors. That's what I found in Oklahoma City, a cadre of Iraqi soldiers that struck us from within. These soldiers are still here. Only the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and all the other agencies of the INS did not track them. That's why, on the eve of the Iraq War, we had stories by Bill Gertz of the Washington Times, and we had the Washington Post, even the New York Times, saying the FBI is looking for people in the Iraqi community that might be sympathetic to Saddam to interview them because they don't know where they are. I found 8 of those soldiers. They successfully brought down a modern 9-story high-rise. They're still living in Oklahoma City, at least a handful of them, as Doug just said. We have to recognize, and they're still recruiting disaffected Americans of all ethnicities, in order to recruit in what they call Osama bin Laden's white army. And there's many examples of these guys, from Jose Padilla, the, quote, classic dirty bomber, the Chicago Hispanic man who was in the prison system, that's where he was recruited, and others, such as John Walker Lynn, the American Taliban. I mean, there's many examples I can cite for you that are cited in my book, The Third Terrorist. We have to wake up to this phenomenon, or they are going to strike us from within, and they're going to do it successfully. And we've got to get informants inside these terror cells. Only the federal authorities I've been talking to are chilled to the bone. They say, Jana, we just don't know who they're recruiting, that are going out and buying the fertilizer, buying the fuel, buying the items needed to construct these bombs to murder American citizens within our shores.
Jana, let's go back.
Keep it up.
Okay, thanks for the call, Doug. Jana, let's go back to the main culprit, Hussein al-Husseini, the man many people connected with Timothy McVeigh many weeks, days, and the minutes prior to the bombing of the Murrah building, referenced in your book, The Third Terrorist. You mentioned that there's a nexus between April 19th of 1995, the day the Murrah building went down, and 9/11. With the Twin Towers. Tell us about that nexus, that connection between these two tragedies and Hussein al-Husseini. What's his involvement with 9/11?
Paul, when I heard on the news after the second plane struck the World Trade Center, when I heard the words Boston Logan, I knew it sounded familiar. And I started digging through, at the time, my 6-year investigation, piles and boxes and filing cabinets, and I thought, where have I seen this? And sure enough, I had confidential psychiatric records of the man identified as the infamous John Doe 2 in multiple eyewitness sightings, in multiple sworn statements, that this man, Hussein al-Husseini, back in 1997, had a nervous breakdown. And he told his psychiatrist he was very, very anxious about working at his place of employment, Boston Logan International Airport. Now, we will remember that's where 2 of the 4 flights originated from on September 11th before striking at the World Trade Center. On November 10th, 1997, Hussein al-Husseini starts experiencing panic attacks that are so extreme, Paul, that he had to check himself into a local psychiatric hospital in the Boston area. He tells his therapist that he's so nervous about his airport job that, quote, if something happens there, I will be a suspect, end quote. Now, some people are going to say, that's a bizarre coincidence. I'm going to tell you it's a sign of terrorist complicity, because at the time he makes a shocking statement to his psychiatrist that something dire is going to happen at Boston Logan, this Iraqi soldier was residing with 2 former Iraqi Gulf War veterans that provided food catering services to the commercial airlines at Boston Logan, and we all know that's how some of those box cutters were planted aboard those doomed flights.
We're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be back with a quick 2.5-minute wrap-up. And remember, folks, this interview with Jana Davis continues this Friday here on Right Talk Radio, Friday at 4 to 5 p.m. We'll be right back.